Picture this: a remote farmstead buried in the Bavarian countryside, where snow falls silently through bare winter trees. 6 people lived here just days ago, 3 generations of one family, their voices echoing through wooden halls, their footsteps marking familiar paths through the snow. But now, nothing but silence. On March 31st, 1922, every soul on this isolated farm was brutally murdered with a farming tool. Their bodies were stacked like cordwood in the barn, yet the killer didn't flee into the night. No, they stayed. For days, living among the dead, eating their food, feeding their animals, sleeping in their beds while corpses grew cold mere feet away. What kind of monster commits such calculated brutality, then casually makes themselves at home? And how, after 100 years and countless investigations, does this case remain Germany's most haunting unsolved mystery? The footprints in the snow told a story that still chills investigators today. Tracks leading to the farm, but mysteriously, none leading away. Today, we'll walk through every terrifying detail of the Hinterkaifeck murders. We'll examine the strange warnings that preceded the massacre, the botched investigation that followed, and the theories that have haunted Germany for a century. By the end, you'll understand why this case continues to grip the world's imagination, and why the killer's identity remains one of history's most disturbing secrets. But first, we must travel back to a simpler, darker time, to a place where isolation bred secrets, and secrets bred death. The winter of 1922 was particularly harsh in Bavaria. Snow lay thick across the rolling hills outside the small village of Gruber, about 40 miles north of Munich. Here, where civilization gave way to endless forests and empty fields, stood a farmstead that locals knew by an ominous name: Hinterkaifeck. The name itself tells a story, hinter meaning behind, and Kaifeck referring to a place name. Behind Kaifeck, behind the world it seemed, the farm sat isolated, accessible only by a single muddy track that wound through dense woodland. In winter, when snow blocked the path and ice made travel treacherous, the inhabitants of Hinterkaifeck might as well have been living on another planet. This isolation suited Andreas Gruber just fine. At 63, he was a man shaped by hard work and harder winters. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who trusted his own hands more than his neighbor's words. Andreas owned the farm outright, nearly 40 acres of good farmland that had sustained his family for generations. But those who knew him whispered that Andreas was not an easy man to love. Living with him was his wife, Cecilia Gruber, 72 years old and bent by arthritis that made cold mornings an agony. She moved slowly through the farmhouse, her footsteps careful on wooden floors worn smooth by decades of use. Cecilia had learned long ago to keep her opinions to herself, especially when Andreas was in one of his moods. Then there was Victoria Gabriel, Andreas's 35-year-old daughter. Victoria's story was written in sorrow, widowed when her husband Karl was killed in the Great War, leaving her to raise 2 children alone. She had returned to her father's farm with 7-year-old Cecilia and 2-year-old Joseph, seeking shelter but finding only more complications. The children brought life to the somber farmhouse. Little Cecilia, named for her grandmother, was a bright girl who loved to help with the animals. She would chase the chickens around the yard, her laughter echoing off the barn walls. Baby Joseph, barely walking, clung to his mother's skirts and babbled in the way that made even stern Andreas crack a smile. Finally, there was Maria Baumgartner, the new maid. At 44, Maria had worked for wealthy families in Munich, but hard times had forced her to accept this position in the countryside. She had arrived at Hinterkaifeck just hours before the murders, carrying a small suitcase and high hopes for steady work. The farmstead itself seemed to crouch against the winter landscape like a wounded animal. The main house was built in the traditional Bavarian style: thick timber walls, steep pitched roof designed to shed heavy snow, small windows that kept heat in but also kept the world out. Connected to the house by a covered walkway was the barn, where Andreas kept his livestock and stored hay for the winter months. But it was what surrounded the farm that made visitors uneasy. Dense forest pressed in from three sides, and local folklore whispered of dark things that moved between the trees. The woods were old, older than memory, and sounds carried strangely through them. A snapping branch might echo for minutes. Footsteps seemed to multiply in the darkness. The family's relationship with their neighbors was complicated at best. Andreas had a reputation for being litigious, quick to argue over property lines and water rights. He'd taken several neighbors to court over the years, winning most cases but making enemies in the process. The closest farm was nearly a mile away, and its owners, the Schlittenbauers, maintained a tense relationship with the Grubers. Village gossip followed the family like smoke. People whispered about Victoria's mysterious pregnancy. Baby Joseph's father was unknown, and tongues wagged with ugly speculation. Some claimed Andreas himself was the father, though such accusations were spoken only in whispers. Others suggested Victoria had taken a lover from Munich, some soldier or businessman who visited in secret. Andreas dismissed the gossip with the contempt he felt it deserved, but the isolation that had once protected his family was beginning to feel more like a trap. The farm that had been their sanctuary was becoming their prison, cut off from help by miles of empty fields and dark forest. As March drew to a close, the spring thaw had begun, but slowly. Patches of brown earth showed through the snow, and the creek that ran past the property gurgled with meltwater. But the cold still bit deep at night, and the wind that swept across the fields carried sounds that made the family's dogs whimper and press close to the house. It was in this atmosphere of isolation and mounting tension that the Gruber family began to notice things that made no sense. Small things at first. Items moved from where they'd been left, sounds from the attic at night, the feeling that someone was watching from the treeline. But just days before their murders, the family noticed something that would chill the blood of anyone who heard the tale, something that suggested their isolation was not as complete as they had believed. It began with the footprints. 3 days before the murders, Andreas Gruber stepped out of his farmhouse to tend to the morning chores. The night had brought fresh snow, laying a clean white blanket across the farmyard. But as Andreas walked toward the barn, he stopped dead in his tracks. There in the snow, clear as signatures in a guest book, were footprints leading from the forest to his farm. Large boots, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. The tracks came from the dark line of trees to the east, crossed the open field, and approached the farmhouse from the side where the family's bedroom windows faced. Andreas followed the tracks with growing unease. They circled the house twice, pausing at each window, as if the intruder had been peering inside. The prints led to the barn, then back toward the house, finally ending at the kitchen door. But here was what made Andreas's blood run cold. While there were plenty of tracks leading to his farm, there were none leading away. The snow beyond the kitchen door was undisturbed, as if the mysterious visitor had simply vanished into thin air. Andreas called his daughter Victoria to see the tracks. Her face went pale as she traced the path with her eyes. "Papa," she whispered. Someone was watching asleep. They searched the property thoroughly, looking for any sign of where the intruder might have gone. The tracks led to doors and windows, but never away from them. It was as if someone had approached the farm and then simply dissolved into the winter air. That same day brought another unsettling discovery. Victoria went to the kitchen to prepare lunch and found a Munich newspaper on the table, a paper none of them had purchased or ordered. The date was current, just 1 day old, but the Gruber family rarely bought newspapers, and Andreas certainly hadn't made the long journey to town to purchase one. Where did this come from? Victoria asked her father. Andreas examined the paper with a deepening frown. It was folded as if someone had been reading it while sitting at their kitchen table. The pages showed fingerprint smudges that didn't match any member of the family. That evening, as the family gathered for dinner, they heard sounds from above, footsteps in the attic, slow and deliberate. The sounds came at irregular intervals throughout the meal, as if someone was pacing back and forth in the space above their heads. Andreas grabbed his hunting rifle and climbed the narrow ladder to the attic. He searched every corner, every shadow, but found nothing. No disturbed dust, no sign that anyone had been there. Yet when he returned to the kitchen, the footsteps resumed almost immediately. Mice, Andreas declared, but his voice lacked conviction. These weren't the scurrying sounds of rodents. They were the measured steps of human feet. The strange occurrences multiplied over the next 2 days. The family's house key went missing from its hook by the kitchen door. They found it the next morning outside in the snow, as if someone had taken it, used it, then carelessly discarded it. Tools disappeared from the barn and reappeared in different locations. Andreas's favorite hammer vanished from his workbench and was found the next day, hanging from a nail in the chicken coop. His wife's sewing scissors moved from her basket to the windowsill in young Kazilia's bedroom. Most disturbing of all were the sounds at night. The family began to hear what sounded like someone moving through the house after they had gone to bed. Floorboards creaked in the hallway, doors seemed to open and close, and once, Victoria swore she heard someone in the kitchen preparing a meal, the clink of dishes, the scrape of a chair, the soft bubble of water boiling. When she crept downstairs to investigate, she found the kitchen exactly as she had left it, but warm, as if someone had just been cooking there. The previous maid, a woman named Walburga Spangler, had quit just 2 weeks before these incidents began. When neighbors asked why she left such a well-paying position, Walburga would only say that the house was haunted and that she feared for her safety. "There are things in that attic," she told anyone who would listen. "Footsteps when everyone is asleep. Someone moving around up there after the family goes to bed. I heard them talking sometimes, whispering voices that didn't belong to any of the Grubers." The other villagers dismissed Walburga's claims as superstition, but Andreas Gruber wasn't so sure. He had lived in that house for decades and knew every sound it made. These were not the settling noises of old wood or the scurrying of animals. These were human sounds. On the day before the murders, Andreas confided his fears to his neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Despite their sometimes contentious relationship, Schlittenbauer was the closest thing to a friend Andreas had. "Someone's been watching the farm," Andreas told him. "Coming at night, looking in our windows. I found their tracks in the snow, but I can't figure out where they go." Schlittenbauer examined the mysterious footprints himself and had to admit they were deeply unsettling. "Have you reported this to the police?" Andreas shook his head. The nearest police station was miles away, and he had little faith in law enforcement's ability to catch a prowler who seemed capable of appearing and disappearing at will. "Keep your rifle loaded," Schlittenbauer advised, "and maybe you should all stay somewhere else for a few nights, until this person moves on." But Andreas Gruber was a stubborn man. This was his farm, his home, his land. He would not be driven away by some midnight prowler, no matter how clever they thought themselves to be. That night, March 30th, 1922, the sounds in the attic were louder than ever. The family heard footsteps, the scraping of furniture being moved, and once, what sounded like someone laughing softly to themselves. Victoria wanted to pack the children and flee to her sister's house in town, but Andreas refused. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'm going up there with my rifle and settling this once and for all." But Andreas Gruber would never get that chance. Because tomorrow, the mysterious presence that had been stalking their farm would finally reveal itself, and the revelation would be written in blood. March 31st, 1922. Good Friday. A day that should have brought peace to the Gruber family, but instead brought an ending so brutal that it would echo through history. The day began normally enough. Andreas rose before dawn, as was his habit, to tend to the animals. The mysterious footprint from previous days had been covered by a light snowfall during the night, giving him some hope that their prowler had moved on. Maria Baumgartner, the new maid, had arrived the evening before and was eager to prove herself worthy of the position. She busied herself with cleaning the kitchen and preparing breakfast, trying to ignore the family's obvious tension about recent strange occurrences. Young Kazilia helped her grandmother with the morning chores, her cheerful chatter filling the house with the sound of normalcy. 2-year-old Joseph toddled around the kitchen, getting under everyone's feet and making them smile despite their worries. Victoria spent the morning in the barn, milking the cows, and collecting eggs. The familiar routine was comforting after days of unease, and for a few hours, the farm felt like home again rather than a place under siege. But as evening approached, the temperature dropped and a fog began to roll in from the forest. By 6 o'clock, visibility was limited to just a few yards, and the world beyond the farm seemed to disappear entirely. This was when the killer struck. Investigators would later piece together the timeline of that terrible night through physical evidence and the positions of the bodies. What they discovered painted a picture of calculated, methodical murder that began in the barn and ended in the house. The killer chose their moment perfectly. As was the family's custom, Andreas and his wife Kazilia went to the barn around 7 o'clock for the evening feeding. The fog provided perfect cover, muffling sounds and concealing movement. Andreas entered the barn first, carrying a lantern and a bucket of feed. He never saw the attack coming. The killer struck him from behind with a mattock, a heavy farming tool with a broad blade used for digging and chopping. The blow caught Andreas at the base of his skull, dropping him instantly to the straw-covered floor. But the killer wasn't finished with him. They struck again and again, ensuring Andreas would never rise. Kazilia Gruber, Andreas's elderly wife, must have heard the commotion and entered the barn to investigate. She found her husband's body and likely opened her mouth to scream, but the killer was waiting. The same mattock that had killed Andreas was turned on her, striking her down beside her husband's corpse. The killer then did something that revealed their familiarity with the farm and the family's routines. Instead of fleeing, they waited in the shadows of the barn, knowing that Victoria and little Kazilia would soon come looking for the elderly couple. Sure enough, when Andreas and his wife failed to return to the house, Victoria grew worried. She took young Kazilia by the hand and walked through the fog toward the barn, calling out for her parents. "Papa, Mama, are you all right?" The killer let them enter the barn. Let them see the bodies. Let the horror register on their faces before striking. Victoria died trying to shield her daughter, her arms wrapped protectively around 7-year-old Kazilia, even as the mattock fell again and again. Little Kazilia's final moments were spent in her mother's embrace, both of them cut down in the same terrible instant. But the killer's work was not yet finished. They stacked the 4 bodies like cordwood in the corner of the barn, then covered them with hay and straw. The methodical arrangement suggested someone trying to conceal the crime, or perhaps someone who simply couldn't bear to look at what they had done. Then the killer walked calmly through the fog to the farmhouse, where Maria Baumgartner and baby Joseph waited unknowingly for the family's return. Maria must have been growing worried, as the evening stretched on without word from the Grubers. She likely went to the window multiple times, peering out into the fog and listening for their voices. When she heard footsteps on the kitchen porch, she probably felt relief. But it wasn't the Gruber family returning. The killer entered the house using the family's own key, possibly the same key that had gone missing days earlier. Maria may have heard the door open and called out a greeting, expecting to see Andreas or Victoria. Instead, she saw death approaching. Maria Baumgartner died in the kitchen, struck down with the same mattock that had killed the others. She fell near the stove, her blood pooling on the wooden floor she had scrubbed clean just hours before. 2-year-old Joseph was found in his crib in the small bedroom off the kitchen. The innocent child, who had spent his brief life surrounded by love and laughter, was murdered as he slept. The killer showed no mercy, no hesitation. Joseph died without ever waking, without knowing that his family was already gone. 6 people, 3 generations, all dead within the span of perhaps 30 minutes. But here's where the Hinterkaifeck case becomes not just a murder, but something far more disturbing. Because the killer didn't flee into the night like a normal murderer would. They didn't panic, didn't run for the safety of darkness and distance. Instead, they did something that still chills investigators a century later. They made themselves a home. The evidence shows that after completing the murders, the killer calmly walked to the kitchen sink and washed the blood from their hands. They hung up their coat on the hook by the door. They built up the fire in the kitchen stove. Then they sat down at the kitchen table and ate dinner. The killer spent that first night in the house with the bodies, sleeping in one of the bedrooms while 6 corpses lay cooling just yards away. They fed the animals, milked the cows, collected the eggs, maintaining the farm's daily routine as if nothing had happened. Neighbors would later report seeing smoke rising from the Hinterkaifeck chimney for days after the murders, evidence that someone was living in the house, keeping warm, cooking meals. The killer ate the family's food, slept in their beds, and tended their animals while the bodies in the barn began to decay. What kind of person commits such calculated murder, then casually continues living on the scene of the crime? What drove them to stay in that house of death, surrounded by the evidence of their terrible deed? The answers to those questions would prove as elusive as the killer themselves. Because as the days passed and the fog lifted, the isolated farmstead remained silent. No one came looking for the Gruber family. No one noticed their absence. In their remote corner of Bavaria, they had simply vanished from the world, and their killer continued to live among the dead. What happened in the days following the murders reveals a psychological profile so disturbing that it defies easy explanation. The killer didn't flee Hinterkaifeck like a normal murderer would. Instead, they transformed from executioner to caretaker, living openly on the farm while 6 bodies decomposed in the barn. The evidence of this macabre residence was overwhelming. Neighbors reported seeing smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney every day for 3 days after the murders. Someone was keeping the fires burning, cooking meals, maintaining the basic functions of daily life. The killer ate breakfast at the kitchen table where the Gruber family had shared their last meal. They slept in the beds where Andreas and Kazilia had worried about mysterious footprints in the snow. They walked through rooms where Maria Baumgartner had hoped to build a new life, where little Joseph had taken his first steps. But most disturbing of all, they tended to the animals with the same care Andreas had shown. The cows were milked daily, an essential task that couldn't be delayed without causing the animals suffering. The killer performed this chore methodically, probably at the same times Andreas had always done it. They fed the chickens, collected eggs, and even cleaned out the animal stalls. This wasn't the behavior of a panicked murderer or a robber who had killed during a crime gone wrong. This was someone comfortable on the farm, familiar with its routines, capable of maintaining its operations single-handedly. The killer prepared meals for themselves in the kitchen, using the family's dishes and silverware. They built fires in the stove to stay warm, probably sat in Andreas's favorite chair in the evening. They may have even read by lamplight, passing the time as if they were a welcome guest rather than a mass murderer. Local postal worker Johann Schwager later recalled delivering mail to Hinterkaifeck on April 1st, the day after the murders. He left letters in the usual spot by the kitchen door and noticed that smoke was rising from the chimney. He assumed the family was home, going about their normal business. What Schwager didn't realize was that he was probably just yards away from the killer, who might have been watching from the windows as the mailman completed his rounds. The killer's comfort level on the farm suggested intimate knowledge of the property and the family's habits. They knew which animals needed daily care, where the feed was stored, how to operate the farm equipment. They understood the layout of the house, knew which floorboards creaked, which doors stuck in cold weather. This familiarity would later become a crucial clue in the investigation, but it would also create a list of suspects so long and varied that it overwhelmed investigators. Perhaps most chilling was what the killer did with the bodies. Rather than attempting to dispose of them or hide the evidence of their crime, they simply left the victims where they had fallen, covering them with hay and straw in the barn as if putting them to bed. The arrangement of the bodies showed a strange mixture of brutality and care. They had been stacked neatly, almost respectfully, with their faces covered. Some investigators interpreted this as evidence of remorse, a killer who couldn't bear to look at their victims' faces. Others saw something far more sinister, a person so comfortable with death that they could organize corpses like furniture, creating order from chaos without any emotional disturbance. The killer's psychological state during those 3 days remains one of the most puzzling aspects of the case. How does someone sleep peacefully in a house where they just committed 6 murders? How do they eat breakfast while knowing that bodies are decomposing just yards away? Some experts theorize that the killer was experiencing a complete psychological break from reality, living in a fantasy where they had somehow inherited the farm legitimately. In this delusion, they weren't a murderer hiding from justice, but rather the new owner of Hinterkaifeck, simply carrying on with normal farm operations. Others suggest a more calculated explanation, that the killer stayed to remove evidence, search for valuables, or establish an alibi. By maintaining the farm's operations for several days, they created the impression that the family was still alive, buying themselves time before the bodies were discovered. But there's another possibility that's even more disturbing, that the killer stayed because they enjoyed it. They relished the power of having taken control of the farm, of living in the space they had claimed through violence. The comfortable routine of daily chores, the warmth of the kitchen fire, the satisfaction of completing tasks that Andreas Gruber would never perform again. During those 3 days, several people passed by the farm or had reason to visit. Each time, the killer successfully avoided detection, suggesting they were either extremely lucky or possessed detailed knowledge of the local area and its inhabitants. A traveling salesman stopped at the farm on April 2nd, looking to sell household goods to the family. He knocked on the kitchen door, but received no answer. Later, he would remember seeing a face briefly appear at an upstairs window, someone watching him from inside the house. That face belonged to the killer, who waited silently until the salesman gave up and continued on his route. The killer's ability to hide in plain sight, to maintain the farm's operations while avoiding all human contact, speaks to a level of planning and self-control that makes their crime even more horrifying. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. It was the methodical execution of 6 people by someone who felt no need to flee the scene. But as the days passed, the killer's situation became increasingly precarious. Sooner or later, someone would come looking for the Gruber family. Someone would discover the truth. And when that happened, the killer's strange period of playing house would come to an abrupt and violent end. The question that would haunt investigators for decades was simple but terrifying. Who could commit such calculated murder, then live so comfortably with the consequences? The answer, when it came, would be as disturbing as the crime itself. By Tuesday, April 4th, 1922, the absence of the Gruber family was becoming impossible to ignore. Young Kazilia had failed to appear at school for 3 consecutive days, something completely out of character for the diligent 7-year-old. Her teacher, concerned about the girl's unexcused absence, had sent a note home with another student, but received no reply. The family's neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, was also growing worried. Despite their sometimes strained relationship, Andreas Gruber was reliable about certain things, particularly a planned meeting they had scheduled to discuss spring planting. When Andreas failed to appear and didn't send word, Schlittenbauer knew something was wrong. That Tuesday morning, Schlittenbauer decided to walk the mile through the forest to check on his neighbors. The path to Hinterkaifeck was muddy with snow melt, and as he approached the farmstead, everything appeared normal from a distance. Smoke was rising from the chimney, suggesting someone was home and tending the fire. But as he drew closer, Schlittenbauer began to notice troubling details. The family's dogs, usually alert and territorial, were nowhere to be seen. The farmyard, typically bustling with activity by this time of morning, was eerily quiet. He knocked on the kitchen door and called out, "Andreas, Kazilia, anyone home?" Only silence answered him. Schlittenbauer walked around the property, checking windows and calling the family's names. The barn doors were closed, which was unusual for this time of day. Normally, Andreas would have them open for the morning chores. Growing increasingly uneasy, Schlittenbauer enlisted the help of 2 other neighbors who had accompanied him, Michael Pohl and Jacob Sigel. Together, the 3 men began a systematic search of the property. They tried the kitchen door and found it unlocked. Inside, the house felt wrong, too quiet, too still. The kitchen showed signs of recent use. Dishes in the sink, cold ashes in the stove, a newspaper on the table. But no sign of the family. "Hello," Pohl called out. "Is anyone here?" Their voices echoed through the empty rooms, but no one answered. It was Sigel who suggested they check the barn. As the three men approached the large wooden structure, they noticed an odd smell, sweet, cloying, unmistakably organic. The kind of smell that made your stomach turn and your mind refuse to process what it might mean. Schlittenbauer pulled open the heavy barn doors, and sunlight streamed into the dim interior. At first, everything looked normal. Hay bales, farm tools, the familiar scent of animals and grain. But there, in the far corner, partially covered by hay and straw, was what looked like a pile of old clothing. Schlittenbauer stepped closer, and the truth hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't clothing. It was bodies. Jesus Christ, Pohl whispered, crossing himself. The four members of the Gruber family lay stacked in the corner of the barn like cordwood. Andreas at the bottom, his skull crushed, dried blood matting his gray hair. His wife Kazilia beside him, her face peaceful despite the violence of her death. Above them, Victoria and little Kazilia, mother and daughter embracing even in death. The sight was horrifying enough, but what made it worse was the methodical arrangement. Someone had taken time to position the bodies carefully, to cover them with straw, to create a semblance of order from the chaos of murder. Sigel ran from the barn and vomited in the farmyard. Pohl stood frozen, unable to process what he was seeing. Only Schlittenbauer maintained enough composure to examine the scene more closely. The murder weapon lay nearby, a mattock with dried blood and hair clinging to its blade. The same tool Andreas had used countless times to work his land had been turned against him with brutal efficiency. But where were Maria and the baby? The three men steeled themselves and returned to the house for a more thorough search. They found Maria Baumgartner's body in the kitchen, lying near the stove where she had been preparing what would be her last meal. The poor woman had probably died without understanding why she was being attacked. Baby Joseph they discovered in his crib, the most heartbreaking sight of all. The innocent child lay peacefully, as if still asleep, until you noticed the terrible injury that had ended his young life. 6 people, an entire family, plus their maid, all murdered with the same calculated brutality. Schlittenbauer immediately dispatched Sigel to notify the authorities while he and Pohl remained at the farm to ensure nothing was disturbed. But this noble intention would prove impossible to maintain. Within hours, word of the Hinterkaifeck murders had spread throughout the district. Despite the remote location, curious neighbors began arriving in increasing numbers. Some came to help, others simply to gawk at the scene of such unprecedented violence. By evening, the isolated farmstead was swarming with people. Neighbors, local officials, curiosity seekers, and eventually, reporters from Munich newspapers. The pristine crime scene that might have yielded crucial evidence was being trampled by dozens of boots. People picked up items as souvenirs, a piece of bloody straw from the barn, a button from Maria's dress, even splinters of wood from the murder weapon. The kitchen where the killer had lived for 3 days was invaded by strangers who moved furniture, handled dishes, and destroyed any fingerprints or other trace evidence that might have remained. The local police, when they finally arrived, were overwhelmed. This was 1922, long before sophisticated forensic techniques. The officers had no training in crime scene preservation, no understanding of how easily evidence could be contaminated. Detective George Rain Gruber, the lead investigator assigned to the case, would later write in his report, "By the time we established proper control of the scene, it had been compromised beyond any hope of forensic analysis. The evidence that might have solved this case was walked over, picked up, and carried away by well-meaning neighbors and ghoulish souvenir hunters." But even in its compromised state, the crime scene told a chilling story. The killer had lived comfortably in the house for days after the murders. They had eaten meals, tended the animals, maintained the farm's operations as if they owned the place. Most disturbing of all, they had done so without apparent fear of discovery, suggesting either remarkable nerve or intimate knowledge of the family's isolation. As investigators worked through the night, examining the bodies and trying to piece together the sequence of events, one question dominated their thinking. Where was the killer now? Had they finally fled when they realized discovery was inevitable? Were they hiding somewhere in the vast forests surrounding the farm? Or had they simply melted back into the local population, resuming their normal life as if nothing had happened? The residents of the surrounding villages locked their doors that night and slept uneasily, knowing that somewhere among them might be a person capable of such calculated brutality. The Hinterkaifeck murders had been discovered, but the mystery was just beginning. The investigation into the Hinterkaifeck murders began under the worst possible circumstances. By the time Detective George Gruber arrived from Munich with his small team of investigators, the crime scene had been irreparably compromised. What should have been a pristine location that could yield crucial forensic evidence had become a tourist attraction for the morbidly curious. Detective Gruber, a veteran of 20 years with the Munich police, had never encountered anything quite like this. The systematic nature of the murders, combined with the killer's bizarre behavior afterward, suggested a criminal mind unlike any he had previously dealt with. But the investigation was hampered from the start by the technological limitations of 1922. Fingerprinting was still in its infancy in Bavaria, and the equipment needed for such analysis was located only in Munich. By the time experts could be brought to the scene, any fingerprints that might have been left by the killer had been obliterated by the dozens of people who had trampled through the farmhouse. Blood analysis was primitive at best. While investigators could determine that the blood found throughout the barn belonged to the victims, they had no way to test for the presence of the killer's blood, evidence that might have indicated whether the murderer had been injured during the attacks. The murder weapon itself, the bloodstained mattock, was handled by numerous people before investigators could properly examine it. Any trace evidence that might have linked it to the killer was contaminated or destroyed. Perhaps most frustratingly, the investigators had no way to preserve the crime scene. Photography was expensive and time-consuming in 1922, requiring heavy equipment and long exposure times. Only a few photographs of the scene were taken, and these were of poor quality, showing little useful detail. Detective Gruber focused his initial efforts on establishing a timeline and identifying potential suspects. The evidence suggested the murders had taken place on Friday evening, March 31st, with the killer remaining on the property until sometime on Monday or Tuesday, April 3rd or 4th. This timeline was established through interviews with neighbors and delivery personnel. The postal worker who had delivered mail on Saturday confirmed seeing smoke from the chimney. A traveling salesman recalled being watched from an upstairs window on Sunday. By Tuesday, when the bodies were discovered, the house was empty and cold. The killer had escaped sometime between Sunday evening and Tuesday morning, a narrow window that should have limited their ability to flee far without being noticed. But Bavaria in 1922 was a region in chaos. The aftermath of World War I had left thousands of displaced persons wandering the countryside. Deserters from various armies, refugees from Eastern Europe, and economic migrants moved constantly through the region. A stranger walking the roads would attract little attention. The investigation's first major breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The heads of the 6 victims were carefully removed and sent to Munich for examination by Dr. Hans Heiss, a pioneering forensic pathologist. Dr. Heiss's analysis confirmed that all victims had died from blunt force trauma consistent with the mattock found at the scene. But his examination revealed something more disturbing. The injuries to Andreas Gruber showed that he had been struck at least 7 times, far more than necessary to kill him. This suggested either a frenzied attack or a killer who took satisfaction in the violence. Little Kazilia's injuries were particularly heartbreaking. The 7-year-old had been struck multiple times, but Dr. Heiss determined that she had survived the initial attack and lived for several hours after her mother and grandfather died. The killer had left her to die slowly in the barn, surrounded by the bodies of her family. This revelation transformed the case from simple murder to something approaching torture. The killer hadn't just wanted the family dead, they had wanted them to suffer. Dr. Heiss made detailed plaster casts of the skull fractures and took extensive measurements of the wounds. His work represented the most advanced forensic analysis possible in 1922, and his findings would influence the investigation for decades. Tragically, these crucial pieces of evidence, the skulls and plaster casts that represented the investigation's most important physical evidence, would be destroyed during Allied bombing of Munich in World War II. The loss of this evidence would haunt later investigators who tried to reopen the case. Detective Gruber's team interviewed over 100 people during the initial investigation. They spoke with neighbors, relatives, business associates, and anyone who had any connection to the Gruber family. What emerged was a picture of a family with many enemies and few friends. Andreas Gruber had been involved in numerous legal disputes with neighbors over property boundaries, water rights, and livestock damages. His litigious nature had made him unpopular throughout the district, creating a long list of people with grudges against him. The investigation also uncovered disturbing details about the family's private life. Victoria Gabriel's pregnancy had been the subject of intense gossip, with various men suggested as the father of baby Joseph. Some neighbors whispered about an incestuous relationship between Victoria and her father Andreas, though no concrete evidence supported these accusations. The family's isolation had also created opportunities for enemies. The remote location meant that someone could approach the farm without being observed, commit murder, and escape into the vast forest without detection. But the investigation's biggest problem was the sheer number of potential suspects. The killer's intimate knowledge of the farm suggested someone local, but the methodical nature of the murders indicated careful planning and a cold, calculating mind. Detective Gruber identified several categories of suspects: family members or close associates who knew the farm's layout and the family's routines. This included relatives, former employees, and neighbors with ongoing disputes. Transient criminals who might have been watching the farm, waiting for an opportunity to rob or attack the isolated family. The killer's comfort level suggested they had observed the family for some time. Someone with a personal motive, perhaps the unknown father of Victoria's child, seeking to eliminate evidence of their relationship, or a rejected suitor seeking revenge. The investigation was further complicated by the political situation in Bavaria. The region was experiencing significant unrest in the aftermath of World War I. Communist revolutionaries, right-wing paramilitaries, and various criminal gangs operated throughout the area. Any of these groups might have targeted the Gruber family for reasons ranging from political to purely criminal. As weeks turned to months, the investigation began to lose momentum. Without physical evidence linking any suspect to the crime, Detective Gruber was forced to rely on circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, both notoriously unreliable in a case that had captured the public imagination. The press coverage of the Hinterkaifeck murders was unprecedented for rural Bavaria. Newspapers in Munich, Berlin, and even Vienna covered the story extensively, creating a media circus that further complicated the investigation. Reporters interviewed witnesses, published theories, and sometimes contaminated evidence in their eagerness to break new developments. This publicity brought forward numerous false confessions and bogus tips that consumed valuable investigative resources. Mentally ill individuals, attention seekers, and well-meaning but confused witnesses provided hundreds of leads that ultimately proved worthless. The botched initial investigation would haunt the case for decades. Future investigators, working with better technology and more sophisticated techniques, will be forced to work around the contamination and evidence destruction that occurred in those first crucial days. But even with all its flaws, the 1922 investigation did establish certain facts that would prove crucial to later theories about the killer's identity. The murderer was almost certainly local, familiar with the farm, and comfortable enough in rural Bavaria to escape detection in the chaotic post-war environment. Most importantly, the investigation revealed that this was not a random crime. The Hinterkaifeck murders were personal, planned, and executed by someone with both the knowledge and the motivation to destroy the entire Gruber family. The question that would torment investigators for the next century was simple: who had both the opportunity and the will to commit such a calculated atrocity? As the initial investigation stalled, Detective Gruber and his team found themselves drowning in suspects. The combination of the Gruber family's contentious relationships, the post-war chaos in Bavaria, and the public fascination with the case created a perfect storm of accusations, theories, and false leads. But from this chaos, several prime suspects emerged, individuals whose connection to the family, knowledge of the farm, and potential motives made them the focus of intense scrutiny. Lorenz Schlittenbauer stood at the top of every investigator's list. The 43-year-old neighbor had discovered the bodies, knew the farm's layout intimately, and had a complicated relationship with the Gruber family that included both cooperation and conflict. Schlittenbauer's farm was the closest to Hinterkaifeck, just over a mile through the forest. He had worked with Andreas Gruber on various projects over the years and was familiar with every building, every animal, every routine on the property. If anyone could have maintained the farm's operations for 3 days after the murders, it would be Schlittenbauer. But what made him truly suspicious in investigators' eyes was his relationship with Victoria Gabriel. Neighbors whispered that Schlittenbauer had been romantically interested in the widowed mother, and some went further, suggesting he might be the father of baby Joseph. The timeline was certainly possible. Joseph had been born in 1919, and Victoria's husband Carl Gabriel had died in the war in 1917. During the 2 years between her husband's death and Joseph's birth, Victoria had lived at Hinterkaifeck, isolated and vulnerable. If Schlittenbauer was indeed Joseph's father, he would have had strong motives for silencing the family. In 1922 Bavaria, illegitimate children carried severe social stigma, and an affair with a war widow could have ruined Schlittenbauer's reputation and marriage. When questioned by police, Schlittenbauer's answers were sometimes evasive. He claimed to have been at home on the night of the murders, but his wife was visiting relatives and couldn't confirm his alibi. He admitted to knowing about the strange occurrences at the farm, the footprints, the sounds in the attic, but claimed he had advised Andreas to contact the police. Most suspicious of all was his behavior when discovering the bodies. Several witnesses noted that Schlittenbauer had seemed remarkably composed for someone who had just found 6 murdered people. He had given orders, organized the other men, and taken charge of the situation with a calm efficiency that some found disturbing. He acted more like someone cleaning up a mess than someone discovering a crime, one witness later told investigators. But Schlittenbauer also had compelling arguments in his favor. He had voluntarily organized the search for the missing family, and he had no apparent financial motive for the murders. If he had wanted to eliminate evidence of an affair, killing the entire family seemed excessive when simply removing Joseph would have been sufficient. The Gump brothers, Anton and Karl, represented another category of suspect entirely. These 2 men were typical of the rootless individuals who wandered Bavaria in the aftermath of World War I. Both had criminal records, both had been seen in the area around the time of the murders, and both had disappeared shortly after the bodies were discovered. Anton Gump had served time for burglary and assault, while Karl had deserted from the German army in 1918 and had been living as a fugitive ever since. Witnesses placed them in the vicinity of Hinterkaifeck in late March, and they had been asking about isolated farms where they might find work or shelter. The brothers fit the profile of opportunistic criminals who might have targeted the Gruber family for robbery. But when investigators examined the crime scene more carefully, they found that nothing of value had been stolen. Andreas's cash savings were untouched, Victoria's jewelry remained in her bedroom, and even small items like silver spoons were left behind. This discovery forced investigators to reconsider their theories. If robbery wasn't the motive, why would transient criminals commit such a methodical massacre? Some investigators theorized that the Gump brothers had initially planned a robbery, but had been discovered by Andreas Gruber. In the ensuing struggle, they might have killed him, and then felt compelled to eliminate all witnesses. But this theory couldn't explain the killer's behavior after the murders. Why would robbers on the run spend 3 days maintaining the farm's operations? Why risk discovery by staying at the scene of their crime? Jacob Sigel, one of the men who had discovered the bodies alongside Schlittenbauer, emerged as a suspect when investigators learned about his financial troubles. Sigel owed money to several creditors and had recently approached Andreas Gruber about a loan. Andreas, true to his character, had refused to help his neighbor. Some witnesses reported that Sigel had left the meeting angry, muttering threats about those who have everything while others starve. Sigel knew the Gruber farm well, having helped with harvests and repairs over the years. He understood the family's routines and would have been capable of maintaining the farm's operations after the murders. But like the other suspects, Sigel's motive seemed insufficient for such extreme violence. A debt dispute might lead to a fight, even a single murder, but the systematic execution of 6 people suggested deeper, more personal motivations. The unknown soldier theory gained traction as investigators learned more about the chaos of post-war Bavaria. Thousands of veterans, deserters, and displaced persons moved constantly through the region, many suffering from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some investigators theorized that a deranged veteran had targeted the Gruber family, either randomly or because of some perceived slight. The methodical nature of the murders and the killer's ability to live comfortably among the dead suggested someone whose experiences in the war had fundamentally altered their relationship with violence and death. This theory could explain several puzzling aspects of the case. A disturbed veteran might have the military discipline to plan and execute such a systematic attack. Combat experience would have provided familiarity with violence and death that allowed the killer to remain calm afterward. And the chaos of the post-war period would have provided perfect cover for escape. But investigators could never identify a specific individual who fit this profile. The theory remained compelling, but unprovable. The family secret theory was perhaps the most disturbing of all. This theory suggested that the murders were committed by someone within the extended Gruber family, motivated by dark secrets that the victims had threatened to expose. The rumors surrounding baby Joseph's paternity formed the core of this theory. If Andreas Gruber had indeed fathered his own daughter's child, the shame and legal consequences of exposure would have provided powerful motivation for murder. Some investigators theorized that Victoria had threatened to expose the incestuous relationship, perhaps seeking to escape her father's control or protect her children from further abuse. In this scenario, Andreas himself might have committed the murders to protect his reputation. But this theory fell apart when investigators considered the physical evidence. Andreas was among the first victims, killed in the barn alongside his wife. He couldn't have murdered himself. An alternative version suggested that another family member, perhaps a brother or cousin, had committed the murders to prevent the family scandal from becoming public. The killer's intimate knowledge of the farm and the family's routines would be easily explained by blood relationships. The supernatural theory, while dismissed by serious investigators, gained surprising traction among the local population. The strange occurrences preceding the murders, footprints that appeared and disappeared, sounds in the attic, objects that moved on their own, convinced many villagers that supernatural forces were at work. Local folklore spoke of the forest around Hinterkaifeck as a place where the boundary between the living and dead grew thin. Some claimed the farm itself was built on cursed ground, and that the family had finally attracted the attention of malevolent spirits. While investigators gave no credence to supernatural explanations, they couldn't ignore the psychological impact these beliefs had on potential witnesses. Fear of otherworldly retribution may have kept people from coming forward with crucial information. The Munich connection emerged as investigators delved deeper into Victoria Gabriel's past. During her widowhood, she had made several trips to Munich, ostensibly to visit relatives and handle her late husband's military pension. But some evidence suggested these trips might have had another purpose. Witnesses reported seeing Victoria in the company of well-dressed men, and she had occasionally returned to the farm with expensive items that seemed beyond her means. Investigators theorized that Victoria might have been involved in prostitution or blackmail, using information about her wealthy clients to supplement the family's income. In this scenario, the murders could have been carried out by one of her clients seeking to eliminate a threat. This theory explained the killer's careful planning and the decision to eliminate the entire family rather than just Victoria. It also provided a motive for the 3-day residence at the farm. The killer might have been searching for incriminating documents or photographs. But like so many aspects of the Hinterkaifeck case, this theory raised more questions than it answered. If Victoria had been blackmailing someone wealthy enough to hire professional killers, why were no valuables taken from the farm? Why would a sophisticated criminal stay at the scene for 3 days, risking discovery? As the investigation dragged on through 1922 and into 1923, Detective Gruber found himself no closer to identifying the killer despite interviewing over 100 suspects and following hundreds of leads. The case that should have been solved through methodical police work had become a labyrinth of theories, accusations, and dead ends. But the investigation did establish certain facts that would prove crucial to future generations of investigators. The killer was almost certainly local, familiar with the family and the farm. The murders were personal and premeditated, and the killer possessed both the psychological stability to plan such an attack and the emotional detachment to live comfortably with its aftermath. These facts would guide investigators for decades, even as the case grew cold and the original participants died. The mystery of Hinterkaifeck had become part of Bavarian folklore, a puzzle that each generation would attempt to solve using the tools and techniques available to them. But the killer's identity remained as elusive as ever, hidden somewhere in the tangled web of relationships, secrets, and violence that surrounded the isolated farm where 6 innocent people met their end. The Hinterkaifeck murders refused to fade into historical obscurity. As decades passed, and the original investigators retired or died, new generations of detectives, journalists, and amateur sleuths became obsessed with solving Germany's most notorious cold case. In 1952, 30 years after the murders, the Bavarian State Police reopened the case with fresh eyes and improved forensic techniques. Detective Wilhelm Bauer, who had studied the original files extensively, believed that advances in criminal psychology and investigative methods might finally break the case. Bauer's team re-interviewed surviving witnesses, some now elderly, and discovered details that had been overlooked or dismissed in the original investigation. Several witnesses recalled seeing a stranger in the area during the weeks before the murders, a man who had asked detailed questions about isolated farms and their inhabitants. This stranger was described as well-dressed, articulate, and claiming to be a traveling salesman or land surveyor. He had visited several farms in the district, always asking about family compositions, daily routines, and security measures. Most intriguingly, this man had been seen talking extensively with Lorenz Schlittenbauer on at least 2 occasions, conversations that Schlittenbauer had never mentioned to the original investigators. When confronted with this new evidence, Schlittenbauer, now 63 years old, became agitated and defensive. He claimed no memory of meeting any stranger and suggested that the elderly witnesses were confused or mistaken. But Detective Bauer wasn't satisfied with this explanation. He ordered a thorough background investigation of Schlittenbauer and discovered several disturbing facts that the original investigation had missed. Schlittenbauer had been deeper in debt than previously known, owing money to creditors in Munich as well as local suppliers. His farm was on the verge of foreclosure, and he had been desperately seeking ways to raise cash quickly. More significantly, Bauer discovered that Schlittenbauer had taken out a life insurance policy on himself just 3 months before the murders, an unusual step for a farmer who had never previously shown interest in such financial planning. The policy included a clause that would pay benefits to his estate if he died under extraordinary circumstances, including murder. This discovery raised the possibility that Schlittenbauer had been planning to fake his own death, using the Gruber murders as cover for his disappearance. But Bauer's investigation was cut short when Schlittenbauer died suddenly of a heart attack in 1954, taking whatever secrets he possessed to his grave. The 1960s brought new interest in the case from an unexpected source: criminal psychologists studying the emerging field of serial killer psychology. The Hinterkaifeck murders displayed several characteristics that would later be recognized as typical of organized serial killers: careful planning, intimate knowledge of victims, extended time at the crime scene, and apparent emotional detachment from the violence. Dr. Ernst Kaltenbrunner of the University of Munich published a groundbreaking paper in 1967 titled The Psychology of the Hinterkaifeck Killer, which analyzed the crime from a modern psychological perspective. Dr. Kaltenbrunner theorized that the killer was likely a local man with a deep psychological need for control and dominance. The decision to remain at the farm for 3 days after the murders represented a form of territorial claiming. The killer was symbolically taking possession of the property through violence. The careful arrangement of the bodies in the barn suggested what Kaltenbrunner called post-mortem organization, a psychological need to impose order on the chaos of murder. This behavior indicated someone with obsessive-compulsive tendencies who found the disorder of violent death psychologically disturbing. Most significantly, Kaltenbrunner believed the killer was still alive and probably still living in the area. The psychological profile suggested someone who would have difficulty leaving familiar territory, instead choosing to hide in plain sight among people who knew him well. This theory sparked a new wave of investigation in 1969, led by Detective Hans Müller of the Munich police. Müller focused on men who had lived in the Hinterkaifeck area in 1922 and were still alive in the late 1960s. The investigation identified 12 men who fit the basic profile: local residents with knowledge of the farm, no solid alibis for the night of the murders, and psychological characteristics consistent with the crime. One by one, Mueller's team subjected these men to intensive investigation and interrogation. Several confessed to minor crimes or unrelated offenses under pressure, but none could be definitively linked to the Hinterkaifeck murders. The most promising suspect was George Siegel, a 70-year-old retired farmer who had lived near Hinterkaifeck in 1922 and had a history of violence against animals and property. Under interrogation, Siegel made several statements that seemed to indicate guilty knowledge of the murders. But when investigators checked Siegel's story against known facts, they found numerous inconsistencies. His confession contained details that had been published in newspapers, but excluded crucial information that only the killer would have known. Müller concluded that Siegel, like so many others over the decades, was seeking attention or possibly suffering from age-related mental decline that made him susceptible to suggestion. The 1980s brought new forensic techniques that investigators hoped might finally solve the case. DNA analysis was still in its infancy, but fingerprint technology had advanced significantly since 1922. In 1986, the Bavarian State Police launched Operation Hinterkaifeck, the most comprehensive investigation in the case's history. Using computer analysis and modern investigative techniques, they re-examined every piece of evidence and re-interviewed every surviving witness. The investigation team, led by Detective Commissioner Klaus Richter, made several important discoveries. They found that several pieces of evidence from the original crime scene had been preserved in police storage, including fragments of clothing and wood from the murder weapon. Advanced microscopic analysis of these materials revealed traces of a distinctive type of clay soil that was found only in a small area, about 5 miles from Hinterkaifeck. This discovery suggested that the killer had walked through this specific location either before or after the murders. The clay soil was found primarily on private property owned by a family named Brenner, who had lived in the area since the 1800s. Records showed that Anton Brenner, the family patriarch in 1922, had been questioned during the original investigation, but quickly cleared. When investigators re-examined Brenner's testimony, they found significant inconsistencies. He had claimed to be visiting relatives in Munich during the weekend of the murders, but hotel records from the time showed no registration under his name. More intriguingly, Anton Brenner had inherited a substantial amount of money just 6 months after the murders. Money that came from the sale of property in Austria that he had never mentioned owning. But Anton Brenner had died in 1958, and his surviving family members claimed no knowledge of his activities during the period around the murders. Once again, a promising lead ended in frustration. The most significant development came in 2007, when the case was selected for review by students and faculty at the Bavarian Police Academy as a training exercise in cold case investigation. Using modern criminal profiling techniques, computer modeling, and advanced forensic analysis, the Police Academy team spent 2 years re-examining every aspect of the case. Their conclusion was startling. They believed they had identified the killer with near certainty. The team's final report, submitted to the Bavarian State Police in 2009, concluded that the Hinterkaifeck murders were committed by someone very close to the family who possessed intimate knowledge of their routines and psychology. The report specifically stated, "Based on our analysis of the available evidence, we believe we know the identity of the perpetrator. However, out of respect for the descendants of all those involved, we will not be making this name public." This tantalizing conclusion sparked intense speculation and conspiracy theories. If the Police Academy team had indeed solved the case, why wouldn't they reveal the killer's identity? What could be so sensitive about the truth that it needed to remain hidden nearly a century after the crime? Some observers theorized that the killer had been a prominent local figure whose exposure would cause scandal for their descendants. Others suggested that the murders involved sensitive political or religious issues that authorities preferred to leave buried. The most intriguing possibility was that the killer had been a member of law enforcement or government, someone whose involvement would raise uncomfortable questions about the original investigation. In 2016, the case gained new attention when German television produced a documentary featuring advanced computer modeling of the crime scene. Using 3D reconstruction technology, investigators were able to create a detailed timeline of the murders and analyze the killer's movements through the farm. The computer analysis confirmed several long-held theories. The killer was almost certainly local, familiar with the layout of the buildings, and comfortable working around farm animals. The murders were planned and executed with military precision, suggesting someone with experience in violence or organized operations. But the documentary also raised new questions. The computer model suggested that the killer might not have been working alone. The logistics of controlling and murdering 6 people, even with the element of surprise, would have been extremely difficult for a single individual. This revelation opened up an entirely new avenue of investigation. The possibility that the Hinterkaifeck murders were committed by multiple perpetrators working together. Today, nearly 102 years after the murders, the case remains officially unsolved. The original crime scene has been demolished, the physical evidence has been lost or destroyed, and all the original participants are long dead. But the mystery continues to fascinate new generations of investigators, both professional and amateur. Online forums dedicated to the case attract thousands of participants who analyze evidence, propose theories, and debate the identity of the killer. The Hinterkaifeck murders have inspired dozens of books, documentaries, and fictional adaptations. The isolated farm where 6 people died has become a symbol of rural Germany's dark past, a reminder that evil can flourish in the most seemingly peaceful places. Perhaps most remarkably, the case continues to influence modern criminal investigation techniques. Police academies throughout Europe use the Hinterkaifeck murders as a training case, teaching students about the importance of crime scene preservation, witness interviewing, and psychological profiling. The murders that shocked Bavaria in 1922 have become part of the region's cultural DNA, a story passed down through generations like a dark fairy tale. But unlike fictional mysteries, this one has no neat resolution, no moment when all is revealed and justice is served. The killer took their secret to the grave, leaving behind only questions that grow more complex with each passing year. As we reach the end of our journey through one of history's most haunting unsolved mysteries, we're left with more questions than answers, and perhaps that's exactly as it should be. The Hinterkaifeck murders refuse to be neatly categorized or easily solved, maintaining their grip on our imagination precisely because they represent something beyond our understanding. Think about what we've discovered together tonight. 6 innocent people, 3 generations of a family, plus their young maid, were brutally murdered in their remote farmhouse on a cold March evening in 1922. But this wasn't a crime of passion, a robbery gone wrong, or even a typical family dispute turned violent. This was something far more disturbing. The killer didn't just murder the Gruber family and flee into the night like any rational criminal would. They stayed. For 3 days. They lived in that house of death, eating meals at the kitchen table where little Kazilia had once laughed with her grandmother. They slept in beds, still warm with the memory of their victims. They tended the animals with the same care Andreas Gruber had shown for decades. Who does that? What kind of mind can commit such calculated brutality, then calmly make coffee in the morning while 6 corpses lie just yards away? The psychological profile that emerges from the evidence is chilling in its implications. We're dealing with someone who possessed not just the capacity for violence, but the emotional detachment to live comfortably with its consequences. Someone who could compartmentalize murder the way most of us compartmentalize our daily chores. The killer knew the farm intimately, every building, every routine, every hiding place. They understood the family's relationships, their fears, their vulnerabilities. This wasn't some stranger who stumbled upon an isolated farmstead. This was someone who had been watching, planning, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And when that moment came, they executed their plan with military precision, eliminating 6 people in less than an hour, then settling in for a 3-day stay, as if they'd inherited the property legitimately. The investigation that followed was a product of its time, hampered by primitive forensic techniques, contaminated crime scenes, and the chaos of post-war Bavaria. But even with all its limitations, the original investigation established facts that continue to haunt us a century later. The killer was local. They knew the family well. They had both the opportunity and the motivation to commit mass murder. And they were skilled enough at deception to avoid detection for over 100 years. Modern investigations have brought new techniques and fresh perspectives to the case, but they've also revealed how much crucial evidence was lost in those first chaotic days after the discovery. The skull sent to Munich for analysis, destroyed in World War II bombing. The crime scene, trampled by curious neighbors before investigators could properly document it. Physical evidence, carried away as souvenirs by people who had no idea they were destroying potential clues. Yet, even with these limitations, modern investigators claim to know the killer's identity. The 2007 Police Academy review concluded with near certainty who committed the murders, but chose to keep that information secret out of respect for descendants. This decision has created its own mystery within the mystery. What could be so sensitive about the truth that it needs to remain hidden even now, when everyone involved is long dead? What family secret? What institutional embarrassment? What political complication could be worth preserving over the cause of justice? Perhaps the answer lies not in who the killer was, but in what they represented. The Hinterkaifeck murders occurred during one of the most chaotic periods in German history. The country was reeling from defeat in World War I, racked by economic crisis, political upheaval, and social transformation. In such times, the boundaries between civilization and barbarism become dangerously thin. Normal people find themselves capable of extraordinary evil. Neighbors turn against neighbors. Families destroy themselves from within. The killer who stalked the Gruber family may have been a product of this historical moment. Someone broken by war, driven to madness by loss, or corrupted by the moral ambiguity of a world turned upside down. Or perhaps they were something more timeless and terrible, the kind of evil that exists in every era, waiting for the right combination of opportunity and isolation to reveal itself. The farm where the murders took place has long since been demolished, but its legacy lives on. The case continues to attract investigators, inspire writers, and haunt the collective memory of Bavaria. Tour groups still visit the site, now marked only by a memorial stone, trying to understand how such horror could have occurred in such a peaceful setting. But maybe that's the point. Evil doesn't announce itself with ominous music and dramatic lighting. It doesn't wear a distinctive costume or carry a calling card. Evil looks like everyone else, lives among us, shares our communities and our daily routines. The person who murdered the Gruber family probably attended the same church, shopped at the same market, participated in the same community events as their victims. They may have offered condolences to surviving relatives, helped with funeral arrangements, even joined in speculation about who could have committed such a terrible crime. This is what makes the Hinterkaifeck murders so profoundly disturbing. Not just the violence itself, but the way it emerged from the fabric of ordinary life like a cancer that had been growing undetected for years. As we've seen throughout our investigation tonight, every promising lead has ultimately led to a dead end. Every suspect has been eliminated or proven insufficient. Every theory has been undermined by inconvenient facts or missing evidence. Yet the case refuses to die because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the mystery of evil. We need to believe that such crimes can be solved, that justice can be served, that the universe has some underlying moral order that violence cannot ultimately disturb. The fact that the Hinterkaifeck murders remain unsolved challenges these comforting assumptions. It suggests that some crimes are too perfect, some criminals too clever, some evil too profound for justice to reach. But perhaps there's another way to think about this mystery. Perhaps the real legacy of the Hinterkaifeck murders isn't the identity of the killer, but the questions the case continues to raise about vigilance, community, and our responsibility to protect the vulnerable. The Gruber family died in isolation, cut off from help by geography and circumstance. Their killer succeeded partly because no one was watching, no one was checking, no one was close enough to notice the warning signs or respond to their distress. In our modern world, we often prize privacy and independence above community and mutual support. We live behind locked doors, interact through screens, and pride ourselves on not needing help from our neighbors. But the Hinterkaifeck murders remind us of the dangers of such isolation. They show us what can happen when people become so disconnected from their community that they can simply disappear without anyone noticing for days. The strange occurrences that preceded the murders, the footprints in the snow, the sounds in the attic, the missing keys, were cries for help that no one heard. If the family had been more connected to their community, if neighbors had checked on them regularly, if there had been better communication and mutual support, perhaps this tragedy could have been prevented. This is the lesson we can take from Hinterkaifeck. Not just the importance of solving crimes after they occur, but the necessity of preventing them through stronger communities, better communication, and greater attention to the welfare of our neighbors. So as we conclude our investigation into Germany's most mysterious unsolved crime, I want to leave you with some questions to consider. Who do you think committed the Hinterkaifeck murders? Was it Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor with intimate knowledge of the farm and possible romantic connections to the family? One of the transient criminals who wandered post-war Bavaria looking for isolated targets? A disturbed veteran whose experiences in the trenches had destroyed his capacity for normal human feeling? Or was it someone else entirely? Someone whose identity has been successfully hidden for over a century through a combination of luck, skill, and institutional protection? What does this case tell us about the nature of evil and the limits of justice? Can some crimes truly be perfect? Are there mysteries that will never be solved, secrets that will never be revealed? And perhaps most importantly, what can we learn from this tragedy about protecting our own communities? How do we balance privacy with security, independence with mutual support, individual rights with collective responsibility? The victims of Hinterkaifeck, Andreas and Cecilia Gruber, their daughter Victoria, their grandchildren Cecilia and Joseph, and their maid Maria Baumgartner, died without justice. Their killer lived out their life in freedom, taking their secret to the grave. But their story continues to serve a purpose. It reminds us that evil exists, that vigilance is necessary, and that the price of isolation can be devastatingly high. The footprints in the snow that led to their farmhouse, but never away, serve as a metaphor for all the crimes that remain unsolved, all the victims who never received justice, all the questions that haunt us long after the evidence has crumbled to dust. But they also remind us that some mysteries transcend their particular facts to become universal stories about human nature, community responsibility, and the eternal struggle between good and evil. The Hinterkaifeck murders may never be officially solved, but they will never be forgotten. They've become part of our collective memory, a dark legend that each generation rediscovers and retells, always hoping to finally solve the puzzle that has confounded investigators for over a century. If this story has affected you the way it has affected millions of others, I encourage you to share your thoughts. Who do you think committed these murders? What theory makes the most sense to you? What lesson should we take from this century-old tragedy? Leave a comment below and let me know your theories. Do you believe the 2007 Police Academy investigation really identified the killer? Should their findings be made public, regardless of the potential impact on descendants? Or are some secrets better left buried? If you found this investigation as fascinating and disturbing as I did, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history's most mysterious unsolved crimes. There are so many stories like this, cases that have baffled investigators for decades, mysteries that continue to haunt communities long after the headlines have faded. And remember, the next time you hear strange sounds in your house, the next time you notice footprints in the snow that don't quite make sense, the next time you feel like someone is watching you from the shadows, don't dismiss it as imagination. The residents of Hinterkaifeck learned too late that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are far more dangerous than we want to believe. The ghosts of that remote Bavarian farmstead may never find peace, but their story serves as an eternal reminder. In our interconnected world, we must never forget our responsibility to watch over one another. Because somewhere out there, in every community, in every generation, there are people like the Hinterkaifeck killer, patient, calculating, and waiting for the perfect moment when isolation and opportunity converge. The question isn't whether such people exist. The question is whether we'll be vigilant enough to stop them before they strike. 102 years later, the silence of Hinterkaifeck still speaks louder than any confession ever could. And in that silence, we hear the echo of every unsolved mystery, every unanswered question, every victim who deserves justice but may never receive it. The footprints in the snow that led to that isolated farm, but never away, have become a metaphor for all the mysteries that haunt us. Proof that some secrets are so well kept, some crimes so perfectly executed, that they transcend time itself to become legend. But legends have power. They teach us, warn us, remind us of truths we might otherwise forget. And the legend of Hinterkaifeck will continue to do exactly that for generations to come. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's darkest mysteries. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and remember, the most dangerous monsters are often the ones hiding in plain sight.